Sometimes we provide interactive elements so the user can interact with the page. For example, in this guessing game, the user enters a guess and clicks the Guess button. The game responds with a message. Other times, we want to collect user input that we'll store somewhere. Every shopping website displays a form for entry of name and address details. The user fills out the form and clicks the button to submit or send the entered form data to the shopping site's server. The shopping site then saves the data so it knows where to send the purchases. Anytime we want to collect user-entered data and submit it to a web server, we use an HTML form. The first step to building a form is to design it. What data do you want to collect from the user? How should those elements be laid out? How should they be ordered and grouped? Designing a quick mock-up of the form helps you decide on its layout and organization. We can then build the elements of the form with HTML and style it with CSS. Here's a tip. Try to minimize the amount of data you initially collect. The user may lose interest if asked to fill out too large of a form. You could always provide a way for the user to enter more data later if the user wants to expand on their information or customizations. Once the form is designed, we're ready to code up some HTML. An HTML form is defined with a form element. The form element is rather wordy and tells the browser, "Hey browser, create a section that we'll use to display interactive controls, whose values will be submitted to a web server for processing or saving." That's a mouthful. Let's break that down. The form element itself doesn't really do anything. It has no visual representation. It's just a container. We nest interactive controls, like those we've just covered, in the form. When the user is finished entering information into those controls, the user clicks a button to submit their entries to a web server. The form has two key attributes that control how the form is submitted to the site's web server. The action attribute defines the URL that processes the form's submission, basically defining where to send the user-entered form values. Normally, a back-end developer will provide this URL to you and write the code needed to process the form's value. All you need to do is submit those values to the provided URL. The method attribute defines how that data is sent. The two most popular options are get, which appends the form values onto the URL, and post, which sends the form data as part of the HTTP request body. If those two options are a little murky, that's okay. We'll see the difference between get and post in the upcoming demo. In most cases, the backend developer will provide this setting as well. Within the form element, we nest all of the form controls we need to collect data from the user. These are the same types of interactive elements we've already created. But these controls are missing an important attribute. Form data is submitted to the web server in name and value pairs, so only controls with a name attribute will have their values submitted. We can add a name attribute to each control like this. Any control that collects data to be submitted to the web server must have a name attribute. Often, there is some minimum amount of information that the user must provide before a form can be submitted. For example, when adding a new pet, the pet name is required because it's used later to find the pet. In that case, we add the required attribute. Recall from earlier in this course that the required attribute is on if the attribute is present. Add required to any interactive element that must have a user-entered value. And here's a tip. For a great user experience, minimize how many required elements are on a form. Instead, allow the user to put more information in later through an update process. Lastly, we need a button element for the user to submit the form. When the user fills out the form and clicks the button, the user-entered values collected by the controls on the form are first validated. Since this input is of type email, the entry must be in a correct email format. Plus, any element with a required attribute must be filled in. If the form is invalid, it won't submit to the server. If the form is valid, the user-entered data is collected and formatted as defined by the method attribute. The data is grouped into name and value pairs using the name attribute and the user-entered or selected value. The result is URL encoded. URL encoding is a process that the browser uses to convert any special characters to a format it can transmit to the server. For example, the transmitted data cannot include spaces, so the URL encoding converts any space to a plus sign. The browser then issues an HTTP request, passing the formatted user data to the backend web server. The web server receives the data and processes it, often storing it in a database. The code on the web server is normally written in a server-side language, such as C#, PHP, or Python, and is beyond the scope of this course. Let's look at an example submission. I filled out the form that we'll build shortly and clicked the button to submit my entered values. I pasted the resulting URL here with a little formatting to display it on multiple lines. Here is the URL from the action attribute. Since we set the method attribute to get, the user-entered data is added to the URL as a query string after the question mark. The data is formatted in name and value pairs, separated with ampersands. Here is the pet name from the input element's name attribute, and my entered value of Maki. And here is the owner's email from that input element's name attribute, and my entered fictitious email address. Because the result is URL encoded, it replaced the spaces in the backstory I typed with plus signs, and replaced the @ with a code of %40. Notice the add to mailing list value of on. This is the value that the browser uses when the user checks a checkbox, if we don't provide a different value. We'll talk more about that in the upcoming demo. This is the data that is sent to the backend web server for processing. So, first, mock up the form. Use the form element to define the container for the form controls. Set the action attribute to the URL to use when submitting the form data. The method attribute defines how the data is sent. Use get to send the data on the URL. This is useful if you are sending the data to another page instead of a web server. Don't use get when sending a password or other secure data, as it will appear in the URL. Set the method attribute to post to send the data as part of the request body. It's often more secure and the best choice. Once the form is in place, nest appropriate form controls within the form. And be sure to include a button element so the user can submit the form. Controls on a form have an ID attribute to provide a unique ID and associate a label with the element. We can also use this ID to find the element with code. Every control on the form must have a name attribute to provide a name with each value submitted to the web server. And recall we also use the name attribute to group our radio buttons. Use the required attribute to mark controls that must have a user-entered value, but use it sparingly. For many interactive elements, the user enters a value, but for some elements, the user instead clicks a radio button, checks a checkbox, or selects an option. The value attribute sets the value based on that selection. Next up, let's build a form.